The train groaned, a long, weary sigh of steam and steel, as it surrendered to the finality of the platform. When Annalise Vogel stepped down from the carriage, the wind was the first to greet her. It was not a playful breeze, but a relentless, mournful force, sweeping across an endless expanse of brown grass with nothing to slow it, nothing to soften its cry. It carried the taste of dust and distance, a fine grit that settled on her lips and in the folds of her threadbare dress. The sky was a vast, pale thing, bleached by a sun that offered light but no warmth. On the far horizon, a line of mountains tore at the heavens like the jagged teeth of a wolf's jaw. The town itself was little more than a suggestion, a handful of raw, unpainted buildings huddled together against the immensity of the land, looking as though the next great gust of wind might carry them away. Annalise clutched the handle of her single valise, her knuckles white. The worn leather was the only familiar thing she had left in the world. She stood out. She felt it in the way the rough-hewn men in faded denims and sweat-stained hats paused their work to watch her. She was a pale flower in a field of rock and thistle, her dark wool dress neat but hopelessly out of place, her face bloodless with a fatigue that went deeper than the long journey. Her eyes wide and the color of a stormy sea, took in everything with a quiet terror. This was it, the end of the line, the final, desperate gamble. This was Montana Territory in the year of our Lord, 1878. Inside her, a silent scream of panic coiled in her stomach. This was her last chance, a blind leap from the squalor of a New York tenement into the vast, frightening unknown. She had thought the poverty she fled in Germany was the worst a soul could endure, but the city had taught her of deeper, darker hells. This desolation, as terrifying as it was, had to be better. It had to be. She scanned the handful of faces on the platform, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was looking for a man she knew only from a single, terse letter written in a stark, forceful hand. A name, Elias Thorne. He was not with the others. He was leaning against a thick support post at the far end of the platform, separate, as if the small crowd were a contamination he preferred to avoid. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but there was a stoop to his posture, a permanent curve to his spine as if he carried a great and invisible weight. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but as he pushed it back with a thumb, she saw him clearly. His face was a landscape in itself, weathered and carved by sun and wind into something hard and unyielding. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, the color of ice on a winter lake. But they held no warmth, no welcome. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little for a long, long time. He did not smile when their gazes met. He simply watched her for a long moment, his assessment brief and practical. Then, he gave a single curt nod and pushed himself off the post. As he approached, Annalise felt a tremor of fear. He was even larger up close, a wall of a man who moved with a quiet, deliberate economy. She could see now that he was slighter than he imagined, a fragile thing, a strong wind, like the one blowing now, could probably carry her right off. The exchange of words was as spare and stark as the land around them. "Annalise Vogel?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. She could only nod, her throat tight. "Elias Thorne," he confirmed, as if stating a fact from an almanac. There was no welcome, no pleased to meet you, no gesture of kindness. This was not a courtship. It was a transaction being completed. He reached for her valise, and for a fleeting second, his calloused fingers brushed against hers. The touch was a jolt, a strange, impersonal intimacy that sent a shock through her arm. He took the bag, its weight seeming like nothing to him, and turned to go. Annalise felt the eyes of the townspeople on her back. Their gazes were a mixture of raw curiosity and harsh judgment. A mail-order bride was a spectacle, a woman of unknown history and, to their minds, questionable virtue. Why else would a woman sell herself to a stranger in a place like this? Annalise felt their stares like physical blows, each one a fresh reminder of what she was, of what they thought her to be. She lowered her own gaze to the dusty planks of the platform and hurried to follow the silent man who was now her husband. The journey to the ranch was made in a simple buckboard wagon, pulled by two sturdy, placid horses. The ride was long and silent, the landscape unfolding around them in a terrifying, monotonous majesty. The only sounds were the steady creak and groan of the wagon wheels, the soft clopping of the horses' hooves, and the ceaseless whistling lament of the wind. Elias Thorne did not speak for the first hour. He simply held the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw set. Annalise sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, her body rigid. She tried to make conversation once, a small, hesitant question about the mountains, but his answer was so brief it felt like a dismissal. After that, she remained silent. Occasionally, he would point with his chin, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Bighorn River," he said, indicating a muddy, winding ribbon of water in the distance. Later, Wolf Jaw Ridge, as they passed a formation of sharp, menacing rocks. It was not a conversation. It was an inventory of a desolate kingdom, and he was its solitary king. Annalise tried to find some beauty in the vast emptiness, in the subtle shifts of color in the dry grass, in the sheer, overwhelming scale of the sky. But she could not. She was a creature of crowded spaces, of narrow cobblestone streets in Hamburg, of teeming, suffocating tenements in New York. The comparison was jarring and deeply unsettling. Here, the silence was so profound it felt like a noise in itself, a roaring emptiness that pressed in on her ears and made her feel utterly, terrifyingly alone. The sheer immensity of the land was a weight on her soul. It made her feel insignificant, a tiny speck of life that could be snuffed out and forgotten in an instant. Her thoughts began to spiral into a vortex of doubt. What kind of man chose to live in such profound isolation? What kind of life had he built here? So far from everything. What would he expect of her, this stranger with ice in his eyes? He had paid her passage, had sent the money for her ticket. He had bought her. In a way, the thought made a cold dread seep into her bones. What would he demand as payment tonight? In the dark. "Can I survive this?" The question echoed in the silent chambers of her heart. She thought of the promise she had made to herself in a dark, foul-smelling room thousands of miles away. The promise had been forged in pain and humiliation, a vow that she would never, ever be helpless again. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin against the wind. She had survived worse than this. She would survive Elias Thorne. She would survive Montana. They arrived at the ranch as dusk was bleeding across the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The cabin was a small, solid structure of rough-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud and moss. It looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself, hunkered down low to brace against the wind. A larger barn stood nearby, its wood weathered to a soft silver gray, and a few simple corrals enclosed a handful of cattle and the two horses. The entire place was a testament to solitary, back-breaking labor. There were no frills, no decorations, no signs of a life lived for anything other than pure survival. Elias reined in the horses and jumped down. Without a word, he began to unhitch them, his movements efficient and practiced. Annalise climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff, and looked at her new home. Inside, the cabin was a single, large room. It was meticulously, almost unnervingly, clean, but as Spartan as a monk's cell. A large stone fireplace, black with soot, dominated one wall. In one corner stood a simple bed frame with a neatly folded blanket on the mattress. A plain wooden table and two straight-backed chairs sat in the center of the room. A calico curtain, faded from sunlight, was strung across another corner. separating a small space that she understood was meant for her. Elias Thorne's life was stripped to the bare essentials: a place to sleep, a place to eat, a fire for warmth. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood smoke, worn leather, and something else she could not quite name, a deep, profound loneliness that seemed to have settled into the very logs of the walls. He came in after tending to the horses, carrying her valise. He set it down near the curtained-off corner. He still avoided looking directly at her for more than a second at a time. He showed her the well just outside the door, the neatly stacked wood pile, the cast-iron stove that stood near the hearth. His instructions were brief and practical. The well water is sweet. Keep the wood box full. The stove draws well, but the damper is tricky. He spoke as if he were instructing a new ranch hand, not a wife. The first meal was a silent, agonizing affair. He ladled a thick venison stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table, along with a plate of hard, dense biscuits. Annalise's stomach was a tight knot of anxiety, but she forced herself to eat. The stew was rich and nourishing, but each bite felt like swallowing stones. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was a physical presence, a third entity in the room, heavy and suffocating. She could hear the sound of her own chewing, the scrape of her spoon against the bowl, the ticking of a small clock on the mantel she had not noticed before. After they had eaten, Elias cleared the bowls and then sat in one of the chairs by the fire. He took up his rifle and a cleaning kit. By the flickering light of the fire and a single oil lamp, he began to methodically clean the weapon. The metallic clicks and scrapes of the cleaning rod echoed in the small space. Sharp, precise sounds that only amplified the crushing silence. Annalise sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment she had been dreading. The meal was done. The day was over. The night was coming. Elias finished with his rifle, sighting down the clean barrel before setting it carefully against the wall. He stood up, and her breath caught in her throat, but he did not approach her. He simply gestured with his chin toward the curtained-off space. "That's yours," he said, his gravelly voice low. He paused, then added, "The door has a bolt on the inside." He then walked to a wooden chest in the corner, pulled out a thick wool blanket, and spread it on the floor near the hearth. He was going to sleep on the floor. This small, unspoken gesture was the first crack in his forbidding exterior. It was not kindness, perhaps not even respect. Maybe it was just a simple desire to maintain his own solitude, to keep his life as uncluttered as it had been before she arrived. But for Annalise, it was a profound, shuddering relief that was so immense it almost brought her to tears. It was a reprieve. It allowed her a breath, a moment to feel a sliver of safety in this strange, intimidating place. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a short, jerky nod, not looking at her, and lay down on his makeshift bed, turning his back to the room. Annalise retreated behind the curtain. There was a small cot, a crate for her things, and a single nail on the wall for her dress. She slid the simple wooden bolt on the main cabin door into place. The sound was loud in the quiet room, a definitive statement of separation. She lay down on the cot, fully dressed, pulling a thin blanket over herself. She lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howl outside like a hungry beast. And on the other side of the room, she could hear the strange, lonely sound of a man breathing in his sleep, a stranger who was now, by law and circumstance, her husband. In the days that followed, a routine began to form, dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Elias was gone before the first light of dawn touched the sky, and did not return until after dusk had fallen. He moved with a relentless, driving energy, as if he could keep his ghosts at bay through sheer physical exhaustion. His absence gave Annalise the freedom to explore the small cabin that was now her entire world. It was a space haunted by ghosts. She felt their presence everywhere. One afternoon, while dusting a high shelf above the fireplace, her fingers brushed against something small and wooden. It was a bird, intricately carved from a single piece of pine. Its painted feathers faded to pale ghosts of blue and yellow. It was a thing of delicate, loving craftsmanship, entirely at odds with the stark masculinity of the rest of the cabin. Another day, driven by a restless curiosity, she opened the large wooden chest at the foot of Elias's bed. She knew she should not, that it was a violation of his privacy. But the silence and loneliness were eating at her. Inside, beneath a spare blanket, she found a woman's shawl, woven from soft gray wool. When she lifted it, it smelled faintly, impossibly, of lavender. And tucked into its folds was a small, scuffed leather shoe, the kind a very young child would wear. The items were a stark, painful contrast to the austere world Elias had built around himself. He had a family before, a wife, a child. The realization settled in her chest like a stone, a deep, aching sadness for this silent, grieving man. It was followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. Was she meant to be a replacement for a ghost? Was she supposed to sleep in a dead woman's bed? To fill a space that was carved out by a love and a life that had been violently erased? The proof was on the small hill that overlooked the cabin. A small, fenced-off plot held two simple wooden crosses, stark and white against the brown grass. He never went there when she could see him, but she knew he did. He never spoke of it, and she knew she must never, ever ask. This cabin was not just a home, it was a tomb of memories, and she was an intruder within its walls. The land itself seemed determined to break her. Her first attempts to manage her new life were a series of painful, humiliating lessons. She tried to wash their clothes in a tub near the well, but a sudden, vicious gust of wind snatched a sheet from her hands and sent it tumbling and soaring across the prairie like a lost sail. She spent an hour chasing it down, her face scratched by burrs, her spirit bruised. The small garden patch near the cabin was a patch of defiance against the wilderness, but the soil was rocky and unforgiving. She broke a fingernail on a stone, her back aching from the effort of turning the hard-packed earth. One morning, reaching for a piece of firewood from the woodpile, she saw the dry, rattling shimmer of a snake coiled in the shadows. A scream caught in her throat, and she scrambled backward, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. Elias found her a few moments later, pale and shaken, pointing a trembling finger. He moved with that same brutal efficiency she was coming to recognize. There was no hesitation. He took up a shovel, and with one swift, violent motion, the snake was dispatched. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. "Watch where you step," he said. It was the only advice he offered. But later that evening, when she went to the door, she found a sturdy new garden hoe propped against the wall. The handle was smooth and new, the pale wood clearly freshly carved by his own hands. He said nothing of it, and she did not thank him. It was a silent, practical offering, an acknowledgement of her struggle, and it meant more than any words of comfort could have. Each day, the landscape asserted its dominance. Sudden, violent thunderstorms would roll in from the mountains, shaking the cabin with their fury. The heat of the midday sun was an oppressive, physical weight, and the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, a chilling cold seeped out of the earth and into her bones. Annalise began to understand that survival here was not about triumph or conquest. It was about relentless, weary endurance. A month into their strange, silent arrangement, a late spring snowstorm blew in without warning. It was a freakish, unseasonable blast of winter that descended from the mountains with shocking speed, trapping them inside the cabin. The forced proximity was excruciating. For the first day, they moved around each other like wary animals, the silence stretching between them, made heavier by the constant, deafening roar of the wind outside. On the second day, the oppressive quiet became unbearable. Annalise was sitting at the table, mending one of Elias's shirts, her fingers stiff with cold. To stave off the noise of the wind and the louder noise of the silence, she began to hum. It was a German lullaby her mother used to sing to her, a simple, sweet tune from a life so distant it felt like a dream. She did not even realize she was doing it at first. Elias was at the other end of the room, mending a broken bridle, his powerful hands working the stiff leather. He stopped his work. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly, his clear blue eyes unreadable. Annalise faltered, the tune dying on her lips, expecting him to tell her to be quiet, but he said nothing. He simply watched her for a long moment before returning to his work. Hesitantly, she began to hum again, her voice a little stronger this time. The small, fragile sound of humanity filled the cabin, a tiny act of defiance against the storm's fury. Later that afternoon, she took down the only book in the cabin, a worn copy of the Bible from the mantelpiece. Her English was still halting, learned in crowded night classes in New York, and she struggled with the formal, unfamiliar words. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving silently as she tried to sound them out. Elias finished his task and saw her struggling. He walked over to the table and sat in the chair opposite her. Annalise looked up, startled, expecting a rebuke. Instead, he reached out a finger and pointed to the page. "That word is righteousness," he said, his voice quiet. He sounded it out for her slowly, patiently. Righteousness. He stayed there for over an hour, his low, gravelly voice patiently sounding out the difficult words for her, explaining their meanings in simple terms. It was the longest conversation they had ever had. In that moment, huddled together in the small pool of lamplight against the raging storm, they were not just a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two profoundly lonely people, finding a flicker of warmth in a vast and cold world. The storm was a tragedy of nature, a cruel and biting thing, but in its heart, it birthed the first, fragile seed of their connection. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured clean and glistening under a benevolent sun. The fragile truce born in the heart of the blizzard did not melt away with the snow. It lingered in the quiet spaces of the cabin, a tentative warmth that began to change the rhythm of their lives. As the last traces of winter receded and the vast prairie awoke, turning from brown to a soft, hopeful green, Annalise began to find her footing. The land that had once seemed a terrifying, monolithic enemy began to reveal its secrets to her. The initial shock of its scale gave way to a grudging, then a genuine respect. She learned its moods, its dangers, and its subtle, unexpected beauties. She learned the scent of rain on the dry air hours before a storm, the particular shade of purple in the distant hills that signaled the end of a long, hot day, and the sweet, wild taste of the berries that grew in a sheltered coulee a mile from the cabin. Her days were a litany of relentless work. The garden, under the guidance of the hoe Elias had made her, began to yield stubborn but precious vegetables. She learned to preserve what little it offered, the sharp, clean scent of pickled beans and spiced tomatoes filling the small cabin. She mended their clothes with small, neat stitches, her hands growing calloused and capable. The work was hard, a constant ache in her back and shoulders. But it was honest. It was hers. Elias began to teach her the skills necessary for survival in his world. These lessons became their primary form of communication, a shared language built not of words, but of actions. He taught her to use the rifle. The first time she held it, its weight was terrifying, a cold, heavy promise of death in her hands. Her arms shook as she tried to aim at an old tin can set on a fence post. "Keep your shoulder tight to the stock," he instructed, his voice impersonal, his hands gesturing to correct her stance. "It will kick like a mule if you hold it loose." He was a patient teacher, his instructions clipped and practical. He showed her how to lead a moving target, how to gauge the wind, how to squeeze the trigger gently, not pull it. When she finally hit the can, sending it spinning into the grass, a small, involuntary smile touched her lips. He did not smile back, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not approval, exactly, but an acknowledgement, a recognition. He taught her other things. He showed her which wild plants were safe to eat and which would sicken a person. He pointed out the tracks of deer and antelope, and the heavier, more menacing prints of wolves and the occasional grizzly. Through the shared language of survival, a partnership began to form. It was not a partnership of affection, not yet, but one of mutual reliance. He was the brawn and the knowledge. She was the quiet, steady force that kept the heart of their small homestead beating. Annalise changed. The sun browned her pale skin, and the wind whipped color into her cheeks. Her hands, once soft, became rough and competent. She felt a strength growing in her that she never knew she possessed. A deep, quiet resilience forged in the crucible of the frontier. She was no longer just a survivor of a dark past. She was becoming a creator of a new, uncertain future. The calving season arrived with the full flush of spring. It was a time of anxiety and hope. Each new life a small victory against the harshness of the world. One night, a raw, wet wind howling outside. A young heifer fell into a difficult labor. Elias worked for hours in the dark, lantern-lit barn, his face a mask of grim concentration. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and blood. Annalise, despite her fear and complete inexperience, would not leave his side. She brought him buckets of hot water from the cabin, the steam misting in the cold air. She held the lantern steady, its golden light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Her presence was a silent offering of support, a vigil she kept against the encroaching darkness. The hours wore on. The heifer's moans grew weaker, her strength failing. The calf was breached, turned wrong inside its mother, a knot of life unable to find its way into the world. Elias's arms were slick with blood to his shoulders, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He tried everything he knew, his movements becoming more desperate. Finally, he faltered. He slumped against the rough-hewn wall of the barn, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. He closed his eyes, his face etched with a pain that seemed to go deeper than the potential loss of livestock. "I am going to lose them both," he muttered, the words raw, scraped from a place of old and familiar grief. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly vulnerable. His stoic armor cracked open to reveal the weary, wounded man beneath. He was not just seeing a dying animal. He was seeing failure, seeing another life he was powerless to protect. Annalise acted on pure instinct. She set the lantern down and stepped toward him, placing a hand on his broad, trembling shoulder. His muscles were knotted with tension. "We will not," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the sounds of the wind and the animal's pain. "Tell me what to do." He opened his eyes and looked at her. He saw not pity, but resolve. He saw the same quiet strength that had weathered storms and loneliness and fear, bolstered by her unwavering presence. He straightened up, a new determination setting his jaw. He gave her a series of quick, concise instructions. She followed them without question, her fear pushed aside by the urgency of the moment. He tried one last, desperate time, his grunts of effort filling the barn. Annalise pulled when he told her to pull, her own muscles straining, and then, with a final, great surge, there was a shift, a release. The calf, slick and steaming, slid out into the bloody straw. For a moment, it lay still, a seemingly lifeless form. Then its head gave a little shake, and it let out a weak, bleating cry. The sight of the tiny, wet creature struggling to fold its long, clumsy legs beneath it was a miracle, a triumph. The heifer, exhausted but alive, began to lick her newborn clean. Elias and Annalise stood side by side, their bodies aching, covered in filth and sweat. They looked at the new life, then at each other, in the warm, flickering light of the lantern. A look of profound, weary victory passed between them. It was a moment of deep, non-verbal connection, a shared battle against death that had been won, and in that shared victory, they were bound closer than any words or vows could have ever managed, despite the growing sense of safety she felt within the small world of the ranch. Annalise was still haunted. Her past was not a distant country, but a dark, ever-present shadow that lurked at the edges of her mind. It ambushed her at unexpected moments, triggered by the smallest things. The cloying smell of cheap whiskey on a trapper they passed on the road to town would send a wave of nausea and cold terror through her. The sight of a man's face, twisted in a drunken snarl outside the saloon, would make her breath catch in her throat. The sound of the cabin door bolting at night, a sound that should have meant safety, sometimes echoed the click of a different lock in a different, grimy room. The memories would come in fragmented, visceral flashes. The pattern of the faded, stained wallpaper in a New York tenement, the feel of Silas Blackwood's damp, grasping hands on her arms, the sound of his voice, a cultured whisper that dripped with menace, making promises that turned into threats. She would remember the cold, gnawing desperation that had driven her to answer Elias Thorne's advertisement in the newspaper, seeing it as the only escape from a life that was suffocating her soul. Her nights were the worst. She would often wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, a muffled cry caught in her throat. The nightmares were always the same, a confused jumble of shame and fear from which she could not escape. Sometimes, her small sounds would wake Elias. She would hear the soft rustle of his blanket as he shifted on the floor, but he never spoke. He never acknowledged her distress. Yet, in the morning, she would find a small, silent token of his awareness. An extra log would be on the fire, blazing brightly against the pre-dawn chill. Or she would find a cup of coffee already brewed, its steam rising in the quiet air. They were small, unspoken acknowledgments of her pain, gestures of a clumsy, silent comfort that touched her deeply. Still, her trauma was a deep, dark secret, a stain she carried on her soul. She felt it separated her from this quiet, decent man. She believed it made her unworthy of the safety he provided and the fragile peace she was beginning to find. Elias, too, remained a man walled off by his own sorrow. One bright, windswept afternoon, Annalise was mending a fence near the cabin when she saw him walking toward the small hill. He went through the simple wooden gate into the small, fenced-off graveyard and stood before the 2 white crosses. She watched him from a distance, her hands still on the fence wire. He did not weep. He did not kneel to pray. He just stood there for a long, long time, a solitary, unmoving figure against the vast, indifferent sky. His stillness was more profound, more heartbreaking than any outward show of grief. It was as if he were trying to absorb the sheer, crushing weight of their absence. In that moment, she saw a window into his soul. This was the source of the invisible weight he carried, the reason for the ice in his eyes. Later, through overheard scraps of conversation in town, she would learn their names: Sarah, his wife; Daniel, his young son. Diphtheria, 2 winters ago. A swift, merciless thief that had stolen the heart from his world. He had buried them himself, in the frozen ground. He had chiseled their names into the wooden crosses with his own hands. The deafening silence that had filled this cabin after they were gone was a silence he had never allowed to be broken. His solitude was not a preference. It was a penance. In his mind, he had failed to protect them from the harshness of this land, and he had sworn to himself that he would never let anyone close enough to fail them again. His arrangement with Annalise was meant to be purely practical. He needed a housekeeper, a pair of hands to help stop the relentless tide of the wilderness and his own despair from swallowing his ranch whole. He had not counted on her. He had not counted on her quiet strength, her gentle presence, her sad, searching eyes. She was an unexpected complication, a flicker of light in his tomb of memories, and he was terrified to let it in. A trip to the town of Redemption for supplies was a major event, a journey that took the better part of a day each way. For Annalise, it was a source of intense anxiety. Redemption was a rough, uninviting place. A single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The people were as hard and unforgiving as the land they occupied. The women of the town, in particular, watched Annalise with open suspicion. Judith Miller, the wife of the town's self-righteous preacher, was the worst. She was a thin, severe woman with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that was permanently pursed in disapproval. They saw Annalise's foreign accent, her status as a mail-order bride, and her association with the reclusive, grieving Elias Thorne as marks against her character. A woman who would come to a man under such circumstances was clearly desperate, and in their minds, desperation was a close cousin to sin. Whispers followed her as she walked through the aisles of the general store. She felt their judgmental gazes on her back as she selected flour and salt. Annalise tried to be polite, offering a small, shy smile to the women she passed, but their faces remained cold and closed. Their coldness was a wall she could not penetrate. Elias was acutely aware of the stares and the whispers. He said nothing, but his posture changed. He stood a little closer to her than he normally would, a silent, protective presence at her side. His hand rested on the worn leather grip of the pistol at his hip, and his icy blue gaze swept the room, daring anyone to speak an ill word aloud. His protectiveness made Annalise feel a confusing mix of gratitude and shame. She was grateful for the shield of his presence, but she was deeply ashamed to be the cause of this trouble. She was a liability to him, a foreign object that disrupted the town's harsh, settled order. On the long, silent ride home, the shame sat like a stone in her stomach. One day, Elias returned from a 3-day trip into the hills, tracking down a half-dozen stray cattle. He was trail-worn and weary, a layer of dust coating his clothes and skin. He dismounted, tended to his horse, and then walked toward the cabin where Annalise was waiting. He stopped in front of her and silently handed her a small package, crudely wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Annalise took it, surprised. He had never brought her anything before. She carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a bolt of fabric. It was a simple calico, but its color was a deep, vibrant blue, the color of the sky just after sunset. In their world of brown, gray, and unrelenting necessity, it was a shocking, extravagant gift. She was speechless. Her fingers traced the simple pattern of tiny white flowers woven into the blue. It was the first truly beautiful thing she had owned in years. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question. "For a dress," he said, his voice gruff. He refused to meet her eyes, instead busying himself with loosening the cinch on his saddle. "The brown one you wear. It has seen better days." The gift was more than just fabric. It was an unspoken apology for the way she had been treated in town. It was a gesture of appreciation for her hard work. And it was something more, a tentative, clumsy step toward seeing her not just as a housekeeper or a partner in survival, but as a woman. In the evenings that followed, after the chores were done and Elias was either asleep on the floor or mending gear by the fire, Annalise worked on her new dress by the soft, flickering light of the oil lamp. She carefully cut the fabric and sewed the seams with small, precise stitches. The act of creating something beautiful felt like an act of defiance. It was a rebellion against the ugliness of her past and the harshness of her present. With every stitch, she was weaving a small piece of hope into the fabric of her new life. She finished the dress on a warm evening at the start of summer. She washed herself carefully in the basin, the water cool on her sun-browned skin. She brushed her hair until it shone in the lamplight, leaving it down for a moment before coiling it into a soft knot at the nape of her neck, loosening the severity of her usual tight bun. Then, she slipped the new dress on. The deep blue calico transformed her. It brought out the stormy color of her eyes and set off the warm tones of her skin. She looked at her faint reflection in the cabin's single small window pane and saw not just a survivor, but a woman. When Elias came in from the barn, stamping the dust from his boots on the threshold, he stopped dead in the doorway. He just stood there, staring at her. For the first time since she had met him, the impenetrable calm in his eyes was shattered. It was replaced by a raw, unguarded emotion that made her own heart stop. It was a look of pure, aching want, a look of a starving man seeing a feast. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had been simmering between them for months. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth, its flickering shadows dancing across her face and the deep blue of her new dress. He took a hesitant half-step toward her, his large hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if he were fighting a powerful urge. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage. It was a moment of terrifying, thrilling possibility, a precipice on which they both stood, swaying. But then the moment was broken. She saw the struggle in his face, the battle he waged and won against himself. His mask of stoic control slammed back into place, the ice returning to his eyes. He gave a curt, jerky nod. "It is fine," he said, the word a stone dropping into a deep well. He turned away from her abruptly, moving to the fireplace and grabbing the poker, busying himself with flames that needed no tending. The rejection, however slight and unspoken, was a sharp, physical pain in Annalise's chest. For Elias, turning away was a desperate act of self-preservation. He had come dangerously close to breaking the vow he had made to himself on that frozen hillside. He was close to letting this gentle, resilient woman into the ruins of his heart, and the thought terrified him more than any blizzard or charging grizzly bear. The unresolved tension hung between them in the flickering firelight, a powerful current of something that was both a promise and a threat. The charged silence that had fallen between them that night became a new kind of quiet in the weeks that followed. It was not the empty, distant silence of their first days together, but a quiet filled with unspoken questions and a fragile, simmering tension. The relative peace of their existence held, but it felt precarious, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. They worked, they ate, they survived, moving in a careful orbit around the unspoken desire that had been so nakedly revealed and so swiftly denied. The peace was shattered on a hot, merciless afternoon in late summer. A lone rider appeared on the horizon. Elias saw him first. He was on the high ridge that overlooked the valley, checking on a spring that was threatening to run dry. When his eyes caught the movement, it was a dark speck against the immense, shimmering canvas of the landscape, a tiny disruption in the vast, empty stillness. Strangers were a rarity in this isolated place, and they seldom brought good news. He watched, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard, a deep sense of unease settling in his gut. There was a confidence in the rider's posture, a directness in his path. This was not a lost traveler. This man knew exactly where he was going. As the speck grew steadily larger, resolving into the shape of a man on a horse, Elias noted the details. The horse was a fine-boned creature, a dark bay with a sleek coat that spoke of good grain and regular grooming, a stark contrast to the rugged, durable ranch stock Elias owned. The rider himself was dressed in city clothes, a dark coat and trousers that were ill-suited for the trail, collecting dust and burrs. He sat his horse with an easy, arrogant grace. Down below, near the cabin, Annalise was hanging laundry. The sun beat down on her back, and the air was still and hot. She worked with the steady, practiced rhythm she had developed over the months. Her mind on the simple task, a glint of movement on the trail caught her eye. She paused, one of Elias's shirts half pinned to the line, and squinted into the distance. Her blood ran cold. Even at this distance, with the details blurred by heat haze, there was something horrifyingly familiar about the rider. It was in his posture, the straight, unyielding line of his back, the arrogant tilt of his head. It was a phantom shape from her nightmares, suddenly given flesh and bone and substance under the harsh Montana sun. Her breath caught in her throat, A choked, strangled sound. The shirt slipped from her numb fingers, falling in a heap in the pale, dry dust. The man was Silas Blackwood. He dismounted in front of the cabin with a slick, predatory grace, his movements fluid and economical. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with cold, intelligent eyes the color of slate and a thin smile that never came close to reaching them. He ran a gloved hand over his horse's neck, a gesture that was both possessive and dismissive, before turning his attention to the scene before him. He ignored Annalise completely. She was frozen by the clothesline, a statue carved from terror, her heart a frantic, trapped thing beating against her ribs. Silas's gaze swept over the humble cabin, the barn, the corrals, a faint, mocking amusement in his expression. His attention settled on Elias, who had come down from the ridge to meet him, his long-legged stride eating up the ground. Elias held his rifle loosely in the crook of his arm, his face as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. "Quite the homestead you have got here," Silas said. His voice was smooth and cultured, an educated Eastern sound that was utterly alien in this rough setting. It was the voice from her nightmares. A bit rustic for my tastes, but I imagine it suits a certain type of man. Elias stopped a dozen feet away, the rifle never wavering. "State your business." "My business?" Silas's thin smile widened. "I am looking for a man named Thorne. I was told I would find him here." His cold eyes finally flickered to Annalise, a spark of cruel enjoyment in them as he registered her panic. "I have business with his wife." He said the word wife with a sneering, deliberate emphasis, drawing it out, turning it into an insult. The sound of it struck Annalise like a slap. This was it, the collision she had both dreaded and, in some fatalistic corner of her heart, expected. Her horrifying past had tracked her down and was now standing in the dust of her fragile present, threatening to burn it all to the ground. Elias did not react. He simply took 2 steps to the side, a small, deliberate movement that placed his body squarely between Silas and Annalise. It was a simple, protective gesture, as instinctual as a wolf shielding its den. His face was like stone, his blue eyes chips of ice. "State your business and be on your way," he repeated, his voice dangerously low, a growl rumbling beneath the quiet words. Silas gave a soft, theatrical sigh, feigning patience. "Very well, if we must be so direct." He turned his full attention to Elias, though his poisonous words were aimed at the trembling woman behind him. "It concerns a business arrangement I had with Miss Vogel, or I suppose I should say, Mrs. Thorne, back in New York, an arrangement she saw fit to terminate rather abruptly. You see, she left without settling her accounts. There is the matter of a considerable debt she owes me." His words were veiled, but their meaning was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. He spoke of investments he had made in her, of the cost of her lodging and clothing, painting a picture of a benevolent protector who had been wronged by a cunning, ungrateful thief. Annalise stood behind the solid wall of Elias's back, trembling so hard she thought her legs might give out. The world seemed to dissolve into a hazy, shimmering nightmare. The familiar scent of sun-baked dust and dry grass was replaced by the phantom smell of stale cigar smoke and cheap perfume. She was no longer in Montana. She was back in that grimy, suffocating room in the tenement. The sound of the city, a constant roar outside the window. She felt the same paralyzing helplessness, the same soul-deep shame she had felt then. Silas's very presence was a physical violation, his smooth, venomous voice desecrating the one place on earth where she had finally, tentatively, begun to feel safe. Elias remained silent, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the wooden stock of his rifle. Silas, a master at reading and exploiting weakness, mistook his silence for judgment or indecision. He saw the grim-faced rancher, the simple, religious man, and assumed he was processing the implications of harboring a fallen woman. He decided to press his advantage, to drive the final, killing nail into the coffin of Annalise's new life. "You see, rancher," he sneered, dropping all pretense of civility, "your little German bride is not quite the innocent flower she appears. She has talents, skills she learned on her back in the filthiest corners of the 5 Points. I ought to know." He paused, letting the poison sink in, his eyes glittering with malice. "I taught her everything she knows." The ugly words hung in the hot, still air, stark and brutal. There it was, the truth she had carried like a lead weight in her soul, now thrown out for all the world to see. This was the moment she had been running from, the moment she knew would one day come. She squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of dizziness and shame washing over her. She waited for the final blow, the one that would truly destroy her. She waited for Elias to turn, for her to see the disgust and contempt in his eyes before he cast her out. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, threatening to crush the very breath from her lungs. Elias did not turn. He did not look at Annalise. He kept his cold, steady gaze fixed on Silas Blackwood's smug face. The silence stretched, taut and terrible, broken only by the low whistle of the wind as it stirred the dust around their feet. In that long, silent moment, a war was waged within Elias Thorne. He was a man of his time, raised with its rigid moral codes, its harsh judgments of women, its black and white view of sin and virtue. The words Silas spoke were the vilest accusation that could be leveled against a woman, a brand that marked her as unclean, unworthy, a part of him. The part conditioned by a lifetime of convention, recoiled. But then he looked at the man before him, slick, cruel, enjoying the pain he was inflicting, and he thought of the woman standing behind him. He did not think of her as a mail-order bride or a mystery. He thought of her as he had come to know her over these past months. He thought of her quiet strength, the way she had faced this harsh land without complaint. He thought of her resilience, the way she had coaxed life from the unforgiving soil of the garden. He thought of her kindness, the small, almost invisible things she did to make the cabin less of a shelter and more of a home. He remembered the sound of her humming a German lullaby in the heart of a blizzard, a fragile sound of hope against the storm's fury. He remembered her standing by his side in the bloody straw of the barn, her voice firm and steady, refusing to let him give in to despair. He remembered the look in her eyes just weeks ago, standing in a simple blue dress that had, for one breathtaking moment, made him feel a flicker of life in his dead heart. He weighed the poison of a stranger's words against the undeniable, lived truth of the woman he had come to know. The choice was not even a choice. His voice, when it came, was as flat and deadly as the crack of a whip. "She owes you nothing," he said. He took one step forward, and Silas instinctively took a step back. "This is my land, and this is my wife." He let the words settle, a declaration of ownership and protection that was absolute. "Get off my property now, or they will find what is left of you come spring." Silas was momentarily stunned by the rancher's unwavering defense. He had expected shock, disgust, anger directed at the woman. Not this cold, solid wall of defiance. He misjudged the man before him, seeing only a simple farmer, not a man who had been forged and hardened by loss and survival. He recovered quickly, his shock turning to rage. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that held no humor. "You would choose a whore over your own honor?" His hand moved, a blur of motion toward the handle of the pistol tucked neatly into his waistband. He never cleared the leather. Elias moved with a speed that was terrifying in its economy and purpose. He did not raise his rifle to fire it. He swung it like a woodsman swings an axe, a powerful, fluid arc of motion. The heavy walnut stock connected with Silas's jaw with a sickening, wet crack that echoed in the stillness. Silas's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and then they rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut, landing in a heap in the dust his fine horse had stirred up. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The violence had been swift, brutal, and utterly decisive. He had not killed the man. He had simply broken him and ended the threat. Without a moment's hesitation, he used Silas's own silk cravat to bind his hands behind his back, then used a length of rope from the corral to secure his feet. He hoisted the unconscious man over the saddle of his own fine horse, slung like a sack of grain. He did not look at Annalise. He took the reins of Silas's horse and began to lead it away, walking out onto the vast, empty prairie. He walked for miles, putting as much distance as possible between that venomous creature and the sanctuary of his home. He left Silas on the main trail, miles from the ranch, with a final, quiet warning to his unconscious form never to return. The act was one of primal, absolute protection, a stark declaration written in violence. When Elias returned, the sun was a fiery orange ball sinking below the horizon, painting the bruised sky in shades of blood and fire. The cabin was cast in long, deep shadows. He found Annalise exactly where he had left her. Only now she was sitting at the simple wooden table, her body rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. Her face was pale and streaked with the tracks of silent tears. She was still wearing the beautiful blue dress he had given her. Now, it felt like a cruel mockery, a costume for a life she could no longer pretend she had a right to live. The silence in the cabin was heavier than it had ever been, thick with the ugliness of what had been said, of what had been revealed. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, his large frame blocking the last of the dying light. He walked to the stove, his movements slow and weary, and stirred the coals of the fire back to life. Then he turned to her. "Is it true?" he asked. His voice was quiet, devoid of accusation or anger. It was a simple, stark question that demanded the truth. There was nowhere left for her to run, nowhere left to hide. This was her moment of ultimate vulnerability, her final confession. Her voice was a choked, halting whisper at first, the words catching in her throat on waves of shame. With her eyes fixed on the tabletop, she told him everything. She told him of her parents' sickness and death on the long voyage to America, of being left alone and penniless in a strange, predatory city. She told him of the sweet promises Silas Blackwood had made, offering her work as a seamstress, and of the dark, terrifying trap he had sprung once she was under his roof. She did not spare herself. She told him of the things she had been forced to do to survive, to eat, to simply keep a roof over her head. She laid the entirety of her dark, tragic past bare, piece by painful piece, fully expecting him to stand up, turn his back on her, and walk out the door forever. Elias listened. He stood by the hearth, his back to the growing fire, and he listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask of shadow. When she was finally finished, her voice choked with spent, ragged sobs, she fell silent, bracing herself for the verdict. He did not walk to the door. He walked to the stove, where the coffee pot was still warm. He took down 2 tin cups from the shelf. He poured the coffee, the dark, rich smell filling the quiet room. He placed one of the cups on the table in front of her. Then he pulled out the other chair and sat down opposite her, the small table the only thing between them. He reached across the table and covered her small, trembling hand with his own. His hand was large and warm, the calluses on his palm a geography of hard labor. His touch was not one of passion or of pity. It was firm, steady, and grounding. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his. In the dim, flickering firelight, the ice in his eyes had melted. What she saw there was not disgust, not judgment, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. "That was him," Elias said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "That was not you." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "What you did to survive, that is called courage." In that moment, he offered her more than just acceptance. He offered her grace. He took the ugliness and the shame that she had carried for so long, and he did not dismiss it. He reframed it. He saw the strength in her survival. not the stain of her past. For Annalise, this was a more profound, more powerful rescue than the physical one he had performed hours earlier. This was the beginning of the healing of a wound she had long thought would be fatal. He saw her. He saw all of her, the broken pieces and the dark corners, and he did not cast her away. This act of profound, unexpected empathy solidified the foundation of their love, a love born not in ignorance of their darkness, but in full, unsparing view of it. They sat in silence as the last of the light faded from the sky, leaving them in the warm, intimate glow of the fire. His hand remained over hers, a silent vow passing between them in the deepening gloom. Annalise woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment, she did not remember. There was only the familiar scent of wood smoke and the solid feel of the cot beneath her. Then, the memory of the previous day crashed down upon her, bringing with it a tidal wave of shame and a raw, terrifying vulnerability. She had laid her soul bare, confessing the ugliest parts of her past to the silent man on the other side of the room. The air in the cabin was different. The violent confrontation and the painful confession had irrevocably changed the space between them, scouring it clean of pretense. There was a new, fragile intimacy, but it was laced with a deep uncertainty. She lay perfectly still, listening. She could hear the soft sounds of Elias moving about, his footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. She feared the light of day. She feared that the grace he had shown her in the dark, in the warm glow of the fire, was a fleeting thing, a moment of pity that would curdle into disgust under the harsh scrutiny of the morning sun. She finally forced herself to sit up, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders like a shield. Elias was at the hearth, coaxing a new fire to life. He worked with a quiet, steady focus, his broad back to her. His movements were different this morning. They were gentle. The way he placed the kindling, the care with which he laid a log on the nascent flames, it was all done with a deliberate gentleness that seemed to extend to the very air around him. He did not speak when he saw she was awake, but he poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table for her, a simple continuation of the gesture from the night before. His presence was a steady, reassuring constant in the spinning chaos of her thoughts. The usual silence between them returned, but it was not the silence of awkwardness or distance. It was the silence of shared knowledge, of a trauma witnessed and a truth accepted. They were bound together now, not just by a piece of paper, but by the violent, unspoken secret of what had happened to Silas Blackwood, and by the deeper, more painful secret Annalise had been forced to reveal. A week later, their fragile new world was put to the test. Their supplies were running low, and a trip to redemption was unavoidable. When Elias began hitching the horses to the wagon, Annalise assumed he would go alone. The thought of facing the town, of seeing other people, filled her with a paralyzing dread. "Get your bonnet," he said, his voice quiet but firm, not looking at her. "We are leaving in 10 minutes. It was not a request. Annalise understood immediately what he was doing. He was refusing to hide her. He was refusing to be ashamed. It was a deliberate, public act of solidarity, and it terrified her as much as it touched her. With trembling hands, she tied the ribbons of her bonnet beneath her chin and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. Word had traveled faster than a prairie fire. Silas Blackwood, his jaw swollen and his pride shattered, had not stayed silent. Before leaving the territory for good, he had stopped in redemption, humiliated and burning with a desire for vengeance. He had limped into the saloon and spun a twisted, poisonous version of his encounter at the Thorn Ranch. He painted himself as an honorable man seeking to reclaim stolen property, and Annalise as a cunning, deceitful woman of the lowest sort who had lured an honest, grieving rancher into her trap. Elias, in his story, was a fool, a simpleton bewitched by a painted woman's charms, who had attacked a man for trying to bring a sinner to justice. The town, hungry for drama and eager to confirm its own prejudices, devoured the story. The community's previous suspicion of Annalise now hardened into open, righteous hostility. As she and Elias walked down the town's single muddy street toward the general store, it was as if a chill wind blew ahead of them. Conversations stopped. People turned their backs, presenting them with a solid wall of silent condemnation. Faces that had once been merely indifferent were now masks of cold contempt. Annalise felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible, to disappear into the ground. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty boardwalk, unable to meet the hateful glares. Then, a figure blocked their path. It was Judith Miller, the preacher's wife, her face a mask of pious fury. She stood with her hands on her hips, her thin body rigid with indignation. "We do not want your kind of filth in this town, Mrs. Thorne," she spat, her voice high and sharp, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "This is a God-fearing community of decent folk. We will not have it corrupted by the likes of you." The word filth struck Annalise with the force of a physical blow. The community, desperate for a sense of moral certainty in a chaotic and unforgiving world, had found its scapegoat. Annalise was the serpent in their harsh Eden, and they were united in their desire to cast her out. Elias reacted with a cold, simmering anger that was more terrifying than any shout. Without a word, he wrapped a protective arm around Annalise's shoulders. Pulling her tight against his side, he steered her around the preacher's wife as if she were a rock in the road, and pushed open the door to the general store. His gaze swept over the silent, gawking patrons, a clear and deadly challenge in his icy blue eyes. He dared anyone to speak another word. No one did. He conducted his business with a clipped, dangerous calm, his voice low and even as he listed the supplies they needed. The store owner, a man named Henderson, fumbled with the sacks of flour and sugar, his hands trembling slightly. He served them quickly, eager to have them gone. The transaction was completed in a tense, suffocating silence. The incident solidified their isolation. They were no longer just solitary. They were outcasts. The ride home was a long, miserable journey through a landscape that seemed to mock Annalise with its vast, open beauty. She was crushed by the public humiliation. But more than that, she was consumed by guilt. She had brought this shame upon Elias. She had tainted his name and made him an object of scorn in the only community he had. "I am sorry," she finally whispered, her voice breaking, the words torn from her throat. "You should have sent me away. You should have let him take me." Elias pulled back hard on the reins, bringing the wagon to an abrupt halt in the middle of the empty prairie. The sudden stop startled the horses. He turned on the seat to face her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Annalise," he said, and the way he spoke her name, with a deliberate, gentle tenderness, made her look up at him through her tears. "Look at me." She met his gaze and saw in his eyes not regret or anger, but a fierce, unwavering resolve. "Their opinion," he said, his voice low and intense, "means less than nothing. They live in a world of fear and whispers. We do not." He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "This," he said, gesturing to the vast, empty land around them, to the distant shape of their cabin on the horizon. "This is our home. They do not matter." His defiance on her behalf was a powerful, absolute declaration of his loyalty. He had chosen her, not just over the words of a vile stranger, but over the judgment of his entire world. In that moment, Annalise knew she was no longer alone. Driven back to the ranch, the cabin transformed. It was no longer just a shelter from the wind and the rain. It became their sanctuary from the world, their profound isolation, which would have broken two lesser people, instead forced them into a deeper and more complete reliance on each other. The vast, empty landscape that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a protective barrier, a great, empty moat that kept the hatred of the town at bay. Within the four walls of their home, they began to create their own world, a world with a population of two, governed by their own rules of acceptance and loyalty. The silence between them began to fill with words. They talked more than they ever had before. The conversations starting tentatively in the evenings and often continuing late into the night, their voices low in the quiet darkness. They shared the stories of their pasts, trading the pieces of their broken histories like precious, fragile gifts. Anneliese told him about her family in Hamburg, about her father's small bakery and the smell of fresh bread that had filled her childhood. She spoke of her dreams of being a teacher, dreams that had been shattered and then washed away on the long, terrible voyage to America. And Elias, slowly, painfully, began to speak of Sarah and Daniel. He unlocked the most heavily guarded room in his heart and invited her inside. One evening, sitting by the fire, he told her about his son's laugh, how it had sounded like water bubbling over stones in a creek. He told her about Sarah's skill with horses, how she could gentle the most stubborn colt with a soft voice and a patient hand. He spoke of the terrifying speed of the sickness that had taken them, the helplessness of watching them fade, the deafening, soul-crushing silence that had descended on the cabin after they were gone. Sharing his grief was the most profound act of trust he could have offered. He was showing her the source of all his pain, the reason for the walls he had built so high around himself. He was letting her see him, all of him, just as he had seen her. In that shared space of sorrow and confession, two broken people began to carefully, gently, piece each other back together. Autumn came, painting the prairie in shades of gold and russet. They worked together to prepare for the coming winter, stocking the larder, mending the cabin walls, cutting and stacking a mountain of firewood. A sense of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished, settled over them. But the land was not done testing them. A terrible blizzard hit in late November, an unseasonably brutal storm that descended from the mountains with a shocking, violent speed. One moment the sky was a clear, cold blue. The next it was a churning vortex of white. The wind howled like a banshee, throwing snow against the cabin with such force it sounded like handfuls of sand. They were snowed in, the world outside completely erased, their tiny cabin the only point of existence in a roaring, white chaos. The temperature plummeted to a depth that felt malevolent. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through the log walls and clawed at them with icy fingers. Their woodpile, which had seemed so immense, was not yet fully stocked for the deepest part of winter. It began to dwindle at an alarming rate. On the third night, the storm was at its absolute peak. The firewood was nearly gone. Only a few precious logs remained. The fire in the hearth, their only source of heat, their only source of light, their only defense against the killing cold, was sinking to a bed of glowing, hungry embers. The cold in the cabin was a tangible, deadly thing. Anneliese was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She was wrapped in every blanket they owned. But the cold had sunk deep into her bones, her strength fading with her body heat. Elias sat grimly by the hearth, his own body weary from the constant, losing battle against the cold. He had done all he could. He had stuffed rags in every crack, hung blankets over the door and window. It was not enough. In the dim, flickering light of the dying fire, Anneliese looked at the glowing embers, their light faint and fading. Then she looked at Elias, his face a grim, shadowed mask of exhaustion. Her eyes were wide with a desperate fear that was about more than just the cold. The fire was everything. It was their life. It was their hope. It was the fragile, stubborn warmth that had grown between them. To let it die felt like letting everything die. "Don't let the fire die yet," she pleaded, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. The words frosted in the frigid air. The words were not a command. They were a prayer. Elias looked at her, and in her terrified eyes, he saw the reflection of his own fear. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of losing this, of losing her. He pushed himself to his feet and crossed the small space between them. He knelt before her and pulled her into his arms, blankets and all. He wrapped his own body around her, trying to shield her, to share what little warmth he had left. He held her closer, his face buried in her hair, the scent of her a grounding, vital thing in the face of oblivion. "I will not," he vowed, his voice thick with an emotion that cracked through his stoic control. "I will not." In that desperate, frozen moment, huddled together for sheer survival, all the remaining barriers between them, the grief, the shame, the unspoken desire, finally crumbled into dust. The simmering heat that had been banked between them for so long, held in check by fear and sorrow, finally ignited. He pulled back just enough to see her face in the dying glow of the embers. He saw his own desperation, his own need, his own love reflected there. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation and defiance, of a profound, primal need to affirm life in the very face of death. It was raw and honest and deeply, achingly emotional. She kissed him back with all the strength she had left, her cold fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. They made love for the first time, not on a bed, but on the floor, on the rough bearskin rug before the dying embers of the fire. Their movements were a frantic, beautiful, urgent dance of survival and love. It was an act of ultimate defiance against the storm that raged outside, against the town that had condemned them, against the ghosts of their pasts that had haunted them for so long. They were no longer a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two souls clinging to each other at the edge of the world, creating their own heat, their own light, their own life. They survived the night. In the morning, the storm had broken. The world outside the window was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of deep snow, the early sunlight dazzling on its surface. The wind was gone. A profound, sacred stillness had fallen over the land. Inside the cabin, the fire was out. The air was frigid, their breath misting before their faces, but they were alive, wrapped together in a tangle of blankets and limbs on the floor. Annalise was curled against Elias's chest, his arms holding her in a way he had never held anyone since Sarah. They looked at each other in the pale, clean morning light, seeing each other with a clarity that was absolute, stripped of all pretense. The shame and the sorrow were still there, a part of their story, but they were no longer walls that separated them. They were now part of the shared foundation upon which they would build their life. Elias gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers unbelievably soft against her skin. His touch was full of a reverence that made her heart ache with a fierce, painful joy. "Annalise," he said, his voice soft, the sound of her name a promise. It was not a question or a statement. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It was everything. In the cold, silent dawn, surrounded by a world washed anew, their love was no longer a fragile seedling, but a resilient, deep-rooted thing that had been tested by the fire and the ice, and had endured. The world that emerged from beneath the deep blanket of snow was one of quiet, hard-won peace. The blizzard had been a trial by ice, and in surviving it, Annalise and Elias had forged something new between them, their love, now confessed in the desperate language of survival and consummated in the face of death, transformed the very fabric of their daily existence. The chores were the same. The land was just as demanding, the days just as long and filled with labor, but it was no longer a life of solitary survival, of two separate people enduring side by side. It was a shared life. A new ease settled between them, as soft and quiet as the winter dawns. It existed in the small, unconscious touches, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a cup of coffee, her fingers lingering for a moment on his arm to get his attention. It lived in the shared, knowing smiles that passed between them over a small success in the barn or a joke whispered by the fire. Their quiet conversations no longer felt like a fragile truce against silence, but a comfortable continuation, stretching from the supper table late into the night. And then there was a sound Elias Thorne had not heard in his cabin in a very long time. Laughter. It happened one afternoon when one of the barn cats, in a fit of playful madness, chased its own tail until it tumbled head over heels into a basket of mending. Annalise's laughter was not a loud or boisterous thing. It was a soft, clear, bubbling sound, like a hidden spring coming to life. Elias, who was oiling a harness nearby, stopped his work, the sound striking him with a physical force. He turned and watched her, her face alight with a joy so pure and unguarded it made his own heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He found himself watching her often, a profound sense of wonder filling him. He would watch the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded bread, the efficient grace of her movements as she tended her fledgling garden, the quiet peace that settled on her face as she read by the firelight. He had thought his heart was a dead, buried thing, interred on the lonely hill behind the cabin with his first family. He had believed that part of him was lost forever, but this resilient, gentle woman, who had come to him out of a past darker than he could imagine, had shown him it was possible to live again, to love again. It was a terrifying, miraculous thing, this second spring of the soul, and he did not know what to do with the overwhelming gratitude he felt. One morning, Annalise came to the breakfast table and found a small object resting by her plate. It was a flower, a wild prairie rose, carved with intricate, loving detail from a piece of scrap wood. The petals were delicate and layered, the leaves veined, the tiny thorns perfect. It was a simple, beautiful thing, so lifelike she could almost smell its phantom fragrance. She looked up at Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He was already busy at the stove, his back to her, but she knew. This was not a practical gift like the bolt of cloth. This was a piece of his heart, a symbol of the new, unexpected life that was growing between them, as tenacious and beautiful as a wildflower blooming in the harshest of soil. The fragile hope of that season was a fleeting thing. The deep snows of the late storm, which should have saturated the earth and promised a lush summer, melted away too quickly under a relentless, unforgiving sun. As spring bled into summer, a new trial descended upon them. A brutal, withering drought took hold of the land. Day after day, the sun beat down from a metallic, cloudless sky. The air grew still and heavy, shimmering with a heat that felt like a physical weight. The creek that ran through their property, which had gushed with snowmelt in the spring, dwindled to a sluggish, muddy trickle and then disappeared altogether, leaving a cracked, sun-baked scar on the earth. The vibrant green of the prairie grass faded to a brittle, sickly yellow-brown that crunched underfoot like old paper. The world was dying around them. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like harsh ridges beneath their hides. They wandered restlessly, their lowing calls filled with a miserable, thirsty searching. The garden that Annalise had so carefully tended, the garden that had been a source of such pride and sustenance, withered under the oppressive heat. The leaves of the bean plants yellowed and crisped, and the tender squash shriveled on the vine. The threat of starvation, for both their livestock and themselves, became a real and terrifying possibility. The landscape, which they had come to see as a sanctuary, a protective barrier against the outside world, had once again become their primary antagonist. It was no longer a place of quiet refuge, but a vast, silent battlefield, where they waged a daily war for survival against an enemy they could not fight, the sky itself. The drought created an even more immediate and terrifying danger: fire. The entire territory was a tinderbox. The dry grass, the parched brush, the thirsty trees, everything was fuel waiting for a spark. The air grew thick with a smoky haze that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat, a constant, ominous reminder of distant fires burning uncontrolled in the mountains. Every day, they scanned the horizon, a knot of cold dread tightening in their stomachs at every dark cloud that was not a rain cloud. At every shift in the wind, the threat of a prairie fire was the ultimate terror for a homester. It was a fast-moving, unthinking wall of flame that could consume a lifetime of labor in a matter of minutes. A roaring monster that left behind nothing but blackened, sterile earth and the ghosts of everything that had been. Elias began to spend his days engaged in a desperate, back-breaking labor. With a heavy plow and a team of exhausted horses, he began to dig fire breaks, long, deep furrows of turned earth in a wide circle around the cabin, the barn, and the corrals. It was a seemingly futile defense against a potential inferno, a tiny scratch in the earth against an overwhelming force of nature. But it was the only thing they could do. Annalise worked alongside him. She followed the plow with a shovel and a hoe, clearing away the stubborn clumps of grass and roots, widening the barren strip of earth. The work was grueling, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in her bones, her hands raw and blistered. Their shared labor became a silent prayer for survival, each shovelful of dirt a desperate plea for deliverance. Their isolation, once a comfort, was made worse by the continued shunning of the town. The drought affected everyone. But in redemption, hardship did not breed solidarity. It bred fear, and fear bred suspicion. The community turned inward, its collective gaze searching for someone to blame for their misfortune. When Elias rode to town to try and buy feed for their starving cattle, his jaw tightened at what he found. The prices at the general store, which were already high due to scarcity, were suddenly tripled for him. The store owner, Henderson, a man Elias had known for years, refused to meet his eyes. He would not extend him credit, a courtesy that had always been a given among neighbors. On Sunday, Preacher Miller delivered a sermon from his pulpit, his voice thundering with righteous fury. He spoke of the trials of Job, of how God sends drought and famine to punish the sinful and test the faithful. He never mentioned Annalise or Elias by name, but his words were a thinly veiled arrow aimed directly at their ranch. He spoke of the wickedness that had been allowed to take root in their valley, of the fallen woman and the foolish man who harbored her. The congregation listened, their faces grim and nodding. It was a comfort to have a reason for their suffering, a target for their fear and anger. Annalise, the outsider, the woman with a questionable past, was blamed for the community's hardship. This relentless social pressure, combined with the daily, grinding stress of the drought, put an immense strain on their fragile peace. It was a poison that seeped under the door of their sanctuary, threatening to sour the love that had grown there. It would have been easy to turn on each other, to let the bitterness of the world infect their small, isolated life. One evening, it almost did. They had worked all day under the blazing sun, deepening the firebreak until their muscles screamed in protest. They ate their meager supper of salted meat and the last of the hardened biscuits in a weary silence. Annalise had just come from the garden, where she had watched the last of her tomato plants, which she had been watering with their precious, dwindling well water, finally give up the ghost, their leaves blackened and limp. The sight had broken something inside her. Suddenly, the weight of it all, the relentless heat, the constant hunger, the hatred from the town, the ever-present fear of fire, became too much to bear. She put her face in her hands and broke down in tears of pure frustration and hopelessness. "This land," she wept, her voice choked and ragged. "It wants to kill us. It gives us nothing. Maybe they are right in town. Maybe we are cursed." Elias, exhausted to his very soul, his own nerves stretched thin with worry, reacted harshly. His fear, a constant, cold companion, found its voice in cruelty. "Crying will not fill the well," he snapped, his voice sharp and cold. The words were a slap. Annalise flinched as if he had struck her. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with shock and hurt. In his face, she saw a flicker of the cold, distant man he had been when she first arrived. The man walled off by his grief and anger at the world. The fight was a dark, quiet tragedy in itself, a moment where all the external pressures they faced almost succeeded in breaking them from within. Annalise said nothing more. She rose from the table, her movement stiff with wounded pride. and retreated behind the curtain to her cot. Elias was left alone at the table, the bitter taste of his own words in his mouth, the silence of the cabin now a chasm of accusation between them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elias went outside. The air was still hot, the sky a merciless, star-filled expanse of black. He found her sitting on the bench by the cabin door, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring up at the indifferent cosmos. He sat beside her, not touching her, the silence stretching between them for a long, painful time. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice rough and low. "What I said, that was fear talking, not me." She did not look at him, but she did not pull away. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the confession costing him dearly. "I am afraid," he admitted, the words raw and exposed. "I am afraid of failing again, afraid of not being able to protect you from all this." He gestured vaguely at the dying land, at the world. "I could not protect Sarah. I could not protect Daniel. I will not." His voice broke, and he could not finish. It was a confession of his deepest, most profound insecurity. Annalise finally turned to him. In the faint starlight, she could see the anguish in his face. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. "You do not have to protect me, Elias," she said softly, her voice clear and strong. "You just have to stand with me. We face this together, or not at all." This moment of reconciliation was a critical turning point. It was a quiet, profound recalibration of their relationship. They realized their love was not about one strong person protecting a weaker one. It was about their combined, shared strength. The next day, Elias made a terrible, necessary choice. He walked out to the small herd of cattle, his face grim. He chose half of them, the weakest, the ones least likely to survive the coming weeks. It was a brutal, heartbreaking decision, sacrificing a significant part of their future prosperity for the sake of immediate survival. He did not do it alone. Annalise stood with him, her face pale but her resolve firm. They did the hard, bloody work together. The tragedy they feared finally arrived a week later. A dry lightning storm had passed through the hills to the west during the night, a storm with no rain, only fire. A single bolt struck a dead pine tree, and a small fire began to smolder, fanned by a strong, hot wind that picked up at dawn. It exploded into a raging inferno, a wall of flame that began to sweep across the dry prairie, directly toward them. The sky to the west turned a terrifying, apocalyptic orange, then a sickly, bruised purple-black. The air, already hazy, filled with thick, choking smoke and a rain of fine gray ash. There was no time to run, and nowhere to run to. Their only chance, however slim, was to make a stand. The roar of the approaching fire was a deafening, terrifying sound, like a freight train of destruction, a constant, hungry rumble that grew louder with every passing second. Working with a frantic, desperate urgency, they released the remaining cattle and the 2 horses from the corrals, slapping their flanks to send them galloping away in a blind panic. Giving them at least a chance to outrun the flames, they worked the pump at the well until their arms burned, soaking blankets, quilts, anything they could find, in the last of the precious well water and dragging them onto the roofs of the cabin and the barn. As the fire reached the edge of their land, the heat became a scorching, physical blow. The world became a scene from hell. They grabbed the wet burlap sacks they had prepared and took up their positions along the firebreak. They fought with a desperate, primal fury. Flames, greedy and orange, leaped across the strip of turned earth, igniting the dry grass on their side. They beat them back, the wet sacks hissing and steaming as they made contact. The smoke was blinding, searing their lungs. The heat was so intense it felt like it was cooking the skin on their faces. They worked side by side, a 2-person army against an unstoppable force of nature. Their movements became synchronized, a grim, efficient dance of survival. He would beat down a patch of flames, and she would be right there, dousing the smoking embers that remained. In the midst of the roaring chaos, as a wall of fire 20 feet high bore down on them, Elias had a moment of profound, breathtaking clarity. He glanced at Annalise. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair coming loose from its bun, her eyes wide with terror but also with a fierce, unwavering determination. And he was overwhelmed by a wave of love so powerful it completely eclipsed his fear. He knew, in that instant, that if they died here, in this fire, they would die together. And he knew that their life together, however short, had been more real and full of meaning than all his long years of lonely, empty survival. The fire jumped the break near the barn, a cascade of embers landing on the dry wooden wall. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed that all was lost. "The barn!" Annalise screamed over the roar. Working as one, they ran to the spot. They threw the last of their wet sacks against the wall, beating at the greedy new flames with a strength born of pure adrenaline. For a few terrible seconds, the fire fought back, but they refused to yield. They beat it down, their bodies screaming with exhaustion and pain. The main wall of the inferno, its path diverted by a slight shift in the wind and the stubborn resistance of their firebreak, swept past them on both sides. They were an island, a tiny, miraculous island of green and brown in a churning, roaring sea of black and orange. They had survived. As the last of the great flames passed, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape in its wake, they collapsed. They fell into each other's arms, weeping from sheer exhaustion, from the release of terror, from the fierce, triumphant love that had been tested by fire and had not been consumed. In the aftermath of the fire, the world was a thing of ash and silence. The sky, scrubbed clean of smoke, was a pitiless, hollow blue above a monochrome landscape of black and gray. The air, thick with the funereal smell of ruin, was still and heavy, as if the land itself were holding its breath in mourning. Their small patch of land was a stark, almost unbelievable island of life in the midst of a vast, rolling sea of devastation. The green of their small pasture, the brown of the cabin and barn, the stubborn life still clinging to Annalise's ravaged garden. It all stood in shocking contrast to the blackened, skeletal prairie that stretched to every horizon. The sight was a dizzying mixture of triumph and profound desolation. They had won, they had survived, but they had survived in a dead world. The fire had been a natural tragedy, but it felt like the culmination of all the forces that had been aligned against them. It had destroyed the winter grazing for their few remaining cattle. It had scared off most of the game, leaving the land eerily empty of life. Survival, which had been a hard-won victory, was once again a stark, pressing question mark hanging over their future. They were alive, but their life was perched on a knife's edge, more uncertain than ever. A few days after the fire, as they were clearing debris and assessing the full, heartbreaking scope of their losses, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was not coming from the direction of redemption. Elias watched its slow approach, his hand resting on the axe in his belt, his body tense. Annalise came to stand beside him, her own posture wary. Every stranger was a potential threat, every approach a possible confrontation. As the wagon drew closer, Elias recognized the driver. It was Jedediah Stone, a taciturn old rancher who lived miles to the north, a man who had always kept strictly to himself. He was gnarled and weathered, his face a roadmap of hard seasons, his eyes a faded but shrewd blue. He pulled his team to a halt a respectful distance from the cabin and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the ash. His gaze took in their small, saved homestead, then swept over the blackened desolation that surrounded it. He looked at Annalise, her face still smudged with soot, her hands raw from fighting the flames. And then he looked at Elias. "Saw the smoke from my place," Jedediah said, his voice a dry rasp, like stones scraping together. "Saw you two fighting it when it reached your line, my own barn. It is gone. He said it as a simple, hard fact, without a trace of self-pity. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes on Annalise again. "Heard the stories in town," he said, his tone flat. "Figured they was mostly lies." He spat again. "A woman who can fight fire like that is not any kind of sinner. She is a homesteader." The simple, unadorned statement of respect was the first hand of kindness they had received from another person since Annalise had arrived. It was a cup of cool water in the desert of their isolation, and it almost brought tears to her eyes. "I've got some hay reserves the fire missed," Jedediah continued, getting to the point of his visit. "Not much, but it might see your stock through for a bit. I will trade you a portion of it for your help rebuilding my barn. A strong back is worth more than gold right now." It was a fair offer, an exchange between survivors. This small act of solidarity, coming from the unlikeliest of sources, was a powerful glimmer of hope. It suggested that a community, a real community, built on the foundations of shared hardship and mutual respect, was possible, far from the narrow confines and poisoned well of redemption. Their newfound hope was short-lived. The fire that had nearly destroyed them had also devastated the lands surrounding redemption. Many families had lost winter grazing, outbuildings, and entire herds. The mood in the town was one of desperation and simmering panic, and in that fertile ground of fear, the rhetoric of Preacher Miller and his wife Judith took a dark and fervent turn. From his pulpit, the preacher no longer spoke in veiled terms. He openly, furiously, proclaimed that the fire had been God's righteous judgment upon the land. He claimed it was a divine scouring, specifically directed at the nest of sin being harbored at the Thorn Ranch, the only reason the town itself had been spared the cleansing flames. He thundered, was by the grace of God and the piety of its citizens. This dangerous fanaticism, born of fear and a desperate need for answers, pushed the community to a breaking point. It gave them a target for their rage and a simple, satisfying explanation for their suffering. A small, self-righteous mob began to form, their fear stoked into a burning anger by the preacher's words. They would finish what the fire had started. They would ride out to the Thorn Ranch, cleanse the land of its filth, and drive the sinners out for good. Elias and Annalise saw the riders coming while they were still miles away, a dark cloud of dust rising against the blackened hills. There were maybe a dozen of them, in wagons and on horseback, a grim procession moving slowly but inexorably toward them. There was no escape. This was the final confrontation, the ultimate test. But this time, their enemy was not the blind fury of nature, but the far more terrifying beast of human prejudice and fear. Elias walked into the cabin and came out with his rifle. He took up his position in front of the door, his feet planted firmly, his face a mask of grim resolve. He expected Annalise to go inside, to hide. She followed him out of the cabin, but she did not hide behind him. In her hands, she held her own rifle, the one he had taught her to use. She walked to his side and stood there, her own rifle held steady, her gaze fixed on the approaching cloud of dust. In that moment, she was not a woman to be protected. She was his partner, his equal, ready to face the world beside him. Elias glanced at her, a fierce, proud love swelling in his chest, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The mob arrived, pulling up in a semicircle in front of the cabin. The faces in the crowd were a grim mixture of fear, anger, and a deep, unsettling uncertainty. These were not evil men, for the most part. They were frightened men, men who had lost much and were looking for someone to blame. Preacher Miller, his face flushed with a zealot's fire, dismounted and stepped forward. He raised a hand, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at them. "Elias Thorn! Annalise Thorn!" he cried, his voice ringing with theatrical condemnation. "You are a blight upon this land. You have brought the wrath of God down upon this community with your sin and your filth. We have suffered for your wickedness, and we will suffer no more. We are here to cleanse this land, in the name of the Lord." Before the preacher's dangerous words could ignite the mob to violence, Another sound broke the tense silence, the steady beat of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared over a nearby rise. It was Jedediah Stone, flanked by 2 other ranchers from the north, men whose properties had also been singed by the fire. They did not ride to join the mob. They rode slowly, deliberately, until they were positioned beside Elias and Annalise, a small, solid line of defiance. Jedediah ignored the preacher. He addressed the men in the crowd, his voice a low, powerful rumble that cut through the preacher's rhetoric. "This man and his wife," he said, his chin gesturing toward Elias and Annalise, "saved their home with their own 2 hands. I saw them. While you were all in town praying for rain, they were out here in the sun digging fire breaks. While you were hiding in your church, wringing your hands, they were fighting flames that would have turned you all to ash." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Who among you did the same?" A wave of shame rippled through the mob. The men shifted their feet, their eyes dropping to the ground. Jedediah was not finished. He pointed a gnarled finger at a man in the front of the crowd. "And you, Carl Schmidt," he said, his voice sharp. "Your family nearly starved last winter after the fever took you down. Who gave you $1/4 of his buck to see you through, and never said a word about it to a living soul?" He looked at another man. "And you, Peterson, who helped you track your lost son for 2 days in that first snow, long before this woman ever came here?" He was revealing small, long-forgotten acts of Elias's quiet, solitary decency, simple truths that stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the preacher's poisonous narrative. The moral authority of the mob began to crumble, its foundation of self-righteousness turning to the shifting sands of hypocrisy and shame. They had been so eager to believe Elias was a bewitched fool that they had forgotten the quiet, honorable man he had always been. The confrontation ended not with a shootout, but with the quiet, ignominious dissolution of a mob forced to look at itself in the harsh light of truth. Men began to turn their horses, to climb back into their wagons, their angry purpose draining away, leaving only a sour residue of embarrassment. They rode away in small, shamed groups, leaving Preacher Miller sputtering in impotent rage. His holy war lost without a single shot being fired. It was a victory, not of violence, but of character and truth over blind prejudice. In the months that followed, Elias and Annalise worked to rebuild, but they did not do it alone. They worked with Jedediah and the other ranchers, a new, small community forged in the fires of shared hardship. They helped Jedediah rebuild his barn. He, in turn, helped them mend their fences. They shared resources, traded labor, and created a bond of mutual respect that was stronger and more genuine than anything Annalise had ever witnessed in the town of Redemption. The town itself slowly began to change. The preacher's influence, dealt a mortal blow by his public humiliation, began to wane. Some townspeople, ashamed of their part in the mob, began to offer Elias and Annalise tentative greetings on their rare trips for supplies. Small, awkward gestures of peace. Acceptance was not universal, and it was a long time coming. But the open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging, hard-won respect. Annalise found, to her surprise, that she no longer cared about their acceptance. Her world was here, on this scarred and healing land, with Elias and their new, true friends. One warm evening, almost a year to the day after her arrival, Annalise and Elias were sitting on the new porch he had built for the cabin. They were watching the sun set over the healing land. The black, charred earth was no longer dead. Everywhere, new, vibrant green shoots of grass were pushing up through the ash, a testament to the stubborn, resilient life of the prairie. The land was coming back, scarred but beautiful, just like them. Annalise was pregnant. It was a quiet, joyful secret that had been growing between them for months, a promise of a future they had fought so hard to secure. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The dark tragedy of her past, the fire, the hatred, the pain they had endured, none of it had been erased. but it had been integrated into their story, transformed from a source of shame and sorrow into the very foundation of their incredible strength. Elias wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his gaze sweeping over the vast, wild landscape that had nearly broken them. It was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was no longer terrifying. It was home. The story ends inside the cabin. It is a cold night, much like the one during the blizzard that had changed everything. But tonight, the cold is kept at bay by a warm, steady fire that burns brightly in the hearth. The cabin is no longer Spartan and empty. It is filled with the small, rich signs of their shared life. A shelf along one wall is lined with glass jars of preserved foods, their colors like jewels in the firelight. A new, brightly colored quilt, stitched by Annalise's own hands, covers their bed, the bed they now share. And on the mantelpiece, in a place of honor, sits the small, intricately carved wooden flower Elias had made for her. Annalise is standing before the fire, her hands cradling her swollen belly, a soft, peaceful smile on her face as she watches the dancing flames. Elias comes to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his own large, calloused hands coming to rest protectively over hers. He can feel the gentle, fluttering kick of the new life within her. "The fire," she says softly. Her voice is not pleading, as it was on that other, desperate night. It is filled with a quiet, confident joy. "It is burning bright." He holds her closer, his chin resting on the top of her head, feeling the warmth of the flames on his face and the warmth of the future they have forged together. The fire is no longer a desperate necessity for survival. It is a symbol of their enduring love, their hard-won peace, and the life that is to come. A steady, unwavering light in the heart of the wild, beautiful, and terrible West. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts with us in English.